Hi everyone, welcome back to another video. So this video is the first video of the anatomy and physiology series, and it's just going to be on some basics that you should keep in mind. So let's get started. So first we're going to talk about body plans. So starting off, we're just going to talk about kind of the role of evolution in shaping body plans. So body plans are basically just how, the body of an organism is laid out, and a particular example is a fusiform body plan. And fusiform basically just means, tapered at the ends. And this is really popular in swimming animals because it's really dynamic for moving in water and it helps conserve energy. So some things to keep in mind is bigger body plans might seem better, but the trade-offs of those is that you'll need thicker skeletons to support such a body, and you'll have more muscle mass percentage to move the body, and you'll also have limited mobility relatively. All right, so all animals and other organisms have to engage in exchange with the environment, and something to keep in mind is that the rate of exchange is proportional to the cell membrane surface area, and the amount of material exchange is proportional to total body volume. So every cell in an animal must have access to a suitable aqueous environment. And of course, this is really easy for single-celled animals, right? Because they're one cell, just as long as that cell has access to the environment, everything is good, right? So for multicellular organisms, it's going to be a little more complicated. So there are simple and complex body plans to deal with this. So for simple, we have the example of a hydra. You can see this picture right here. So hydras have a sac-like body. They live in ponds, and they have the walls of their body are only 2 cells thick. So, if the inside of their body and the outside of their body gets to contact their outside environment, then all the cells in their body will, right? And that's what happens. Both the interior and the exterior of a hydra are exposed to water because they have what's called a gastrovascular cavity, and that contacts the environment through the mouth. So it's the same situation with a tapeworm, but instead of having a sac-like body, they have a flat body. And since they have a flat body, most cells are in direct contact with the intestinal fluid of whatever animal they're living in. So for complex body plans, you're going to have a lot of folding and branching that increases surface area. And a benefit is of exchange surfaces being inside the body, is that it protects delicate tissues. It allows for streamlined body contours. And just as a reference, the human digestive system has 25 times the surface area of your skin, and you have a lot of surface area of skin, right? So basically, in complex body plans, exchange between the interstitial fluid, which is the fluid around cells, and circulatory fluid, which will either be blood or hemolymph. So it's exchanged between those two to obtain nutrients and get rid of wastes. And this will be very good for highly variable environments because you're able to maintain sort of a constant interior environment. All right, so here is the hierarchical organization of body plans. So the big concept is that cells make a working body through emergent properties. So, as a singular cell, they do something, but as a group of cells, they do a bigger function. So tissues are a group of similar cells with a common function. Organs are functional units of tissues. An organ system is a group of organs that work together. And something to note is that the simplest animals, like porifera or sponges, don't have any of these. They just have cells that are all very similar to each other that kind of do their own thing. So there's types of analyses you can use to kind of look at this hierarchy. So bottom up is when you look from cells to organ systems, and this reveals emergent properties that result from the cells working together. There's also top down when this is from organ systems to cells, and this reveals the multi-layered specialization as you get more and more specific. All right, so now there are four main types of tissues in an animal. Those are epithelial, connective, muscular, and nervous. So it may come in handy for you to remember all of these, whether it be for Science Bowl or for USABO. So the acronym I have here is CARMEN, like the opera. So CMEN stand for each of these. All right, so now let's talk about epithelial tissue. So epithelial tissue has two surfaces, an apical surface and a basal surface. So the apical surface faces the lumen, which is basically like if you have a tube or something like that, the hole in the middle is the lumen, or it faces the outside, whatever that is. And it usually has specialized projections. And then the basal surface is basically, forms the base and then, has a lot of cells right here. All right, so now let's talk about the types of epithelial tissue. So there's stratified squamous, which looks like this. It's multi-layered, it regenerates rapidly, and there are new cells dividing from the basal surface that push out constantly. And it's found in places with abrasion, such as the skin and the lining of the mouth. So you can see that the structure kind of matches that function, right? Because in those places with a lot of abrasion, these top layers of cells are constantly going to, get removed, and the basal surface dividing very quickly is just going to push new cells to replace those. Now there's pseudostratified columnar. This is a single layer of cells, but the nuclei and height of these cells are going to vary, and it looks like they are stratified or they have layers. And this is found in ciliated cells in mucous membranes, such as kind of in your airways, and they participate in cilial beat, which is basically when the cilia beat and move mucus up. So there's also simple squamous epithelial tissue, and this is good for diffusion because you have one layer of cells, squamous cells, which are these kind of round ones, by the way. Columnar are kind of these blocky ones. So simple squamous is very good for diffusion because you only got one layer and it's very thin and leaky. You're going to find these in places with a lot of exchange, like blood vessels and air sacs, because for blood vessels, you need to exchange like oxygen, nutrients, waste products. Air sacs, you need to exchange oxygen, carbon dioxide. All right, so there's also simple columnar, which is just, one layer of columnar cells, and this is found in places with secretion or active absorption, especially in the intestines where they secrete digestive juices and absorb nutrients. There's also cuboidal, which is found in places with secretion, and this is found especially in the epithelium of kidney tubules. That's something to remember. It's also found in glands like the thyroid gland and salivary glands, and they look like this. All right, so that's it for epithelial tissue. Now let's talk about connective tissue. So connective tissue is made up of sparse cells in an extracellular matrix, which has a web of fibers and a liquid, jelly, or solid. And they contain fibroblasts, which secrete fiber proteins, and macrophages, which engulf foreign particles and cellular debris through phagocytosis. These two are both cell types. So there are three types of fibers in connective tissue: collagenous, reticular, and elastic. So they spell out CRE. Collagenous fibers provide strength and flexibility. Reticular fibers join connective tissues with other tissues, and elastic tissues make tissues elastic. So a nice example that's very common when talking about the types of fibers is if you were to pull back the skin on your hand and let it snap back, the collagenous fibers make sure your skin stays strong throughout that. The reticular fibers are what connect the skin to your deeper layers still even after you pulled it, and elastic tissues are what make your skin snap back. So now let's talk about the types of connective tissue. So loose connective tissue is the most widespread, and it binds epithelia to underlying tissues, and it holds organs in place. It's a loose weave of all three fibers we just talked about, and it's found in the skin and throughout the body. It looks kind of like that. Then there's fibrous tissue, which is dense with collagenous fibers. It's found in tendons, which connect muscles to bones, and ligaments, which connect bones to bones. So it looks kind of like that. And then there's bone, which you might not register as connective tissue, but it's mineralized connective tissue, and it has cells called osteoblasts that deposit collagen, calcium ions, magnesium ions, and phosphate ions, which combine into minerals that mineralize that tissue. And then bone is organized in osteons, which are these like little circles. They're concentric layers of mineralized matrix around a central canal where you're going to have blood vessels. And that's the thing, your bones are actually kind of squishy. Like usually when you see bones, they're like the dried out version, but you have blood running through your bones. So next up is adipose tissue, which is a type of specialized loose connective tissue. And in adipose tissue, fat is stored in adipose cells within the matrix, and each cell has a large fat droplet. So it's going to look a little bit like this. And in general, when you look at kind of histology pictures like this, if you see like a white space, there's usually some type of fluid or, like oil or something in it. And the purpose of adipose tissue is to pad and insulate the body, and it stores fuel. Next is cartilage, and cartilage is basically collagenous fibers embedded in a rubbery protein carbohydrate complex called chondroitin sulfate. And in cartilage, you're going to have cells called chondrocytes that secrete collagen and chondroitin sulfate. So the advantage of cartilage is that it's strong, but it's also flexible. So like the much of your ear and your nose is made out of cartilage, right? And obviously they keep their structure, but you can bend them. So embryonic skeletons often have cartilage, which is later replaced with bone. Next up is blood, and you probably don't think of blood as connective tissue, right? But plasma is the matrix we're talking about, and plasma is just water, salts, dissolved proteins. And blood contains cells like erythrocytes, which are red blood cells, leukocytes, white blood cells, and platelets, which are fragments of megakaryocytes that help plug in wounds. So here's a picture of all of them. Here, there's some of them. So next up is muscular tissue, and muscular tissue is made of filaments with the proteins actin and myosin. So here are the types of muscular tissue. There are three. The first one is skeletal or striated muscle, and this is the type of muscle you typically think of when you think of muscle. It's responsible for voluntary movements, and it contains bundles of long cells fused together called muscle fibers. And muscular tissue is organized in units called sarcomeres, and these are kind of the units that we look at when we look at contraction, and those are what are responsible for this like striated look you see. That's why it's called striated muscle. And something interesting is that building muscle increases the size of the fibers, but not the number of fibers. Next up is smooth muscular tissue. So you're going to see that this one doesn't have those striations, and it's involved in involuntary body activities. It's found in the digestive tract, bladder, arteries, and other internal organs. And they have these spindle-shaped cells that are tapered on both sides. So lastly is cardiac muscle, and it's striated as well. It's somewhat similar to skeletal muscle in appearance. And it forms the contractile walls of the heart. So this is the muscle that makes your heart beat. And it has branch fibers that connect via intercalated discs. You can see them right here. To relay signals and synchronize heart contraction. So these intercalated discs are what really set cardiac muscle apart from, the other two, especially the skeletal muscle, right? So it's kind of a nice mem to just remember cardiac tissue is associated with intercalated discs. So last up is nervous tissue, and depending on the organism, nervous tissue may form a brain. Like for example, humans, we have a brain, but jellyfish only have a nerve net made out of their nervous tissue. So there are two types of nervous tissue to know, or nervous cells. So first are neurons, And so, quick brief on the anatomy of a neuron. You can think of it as a hand. So your palm would be the cell body or the soma, and your fingers would be like the dendrites, and your arm would be like the axon. So neurons receive impulses from other neurons via their soma and dendrites, and they transmit impulses to neurons, muscles, and other cells via axons. So axons are often bundled into nerves as well. And then we have glia, and they're kind of like the support system of the nervous system. So they nourish, insulate, and replenish neurons and modulate neuron function. So here's a picture with a lot of them. And you're going to have some different ones based on what part of the nervous system you're in, whether it's the central nervous system or the peripheral nervous system. So we'll get into that in the nervous system video. But just a quick brief, you have Schwann cells, oligodendrocytes, they myelinate axons, that helps with conduction. Microglial cells help with immune function. Ependymal cells help with cerebrospinal fluid. Astrocytes do a lot of things, but they help with the blood-brain barrier. Alright, so now let's talk about coordination and control of the body, because we just talked about a bunch of parts of the body, but they gotta work together to make your body work properly, right? So the endocrine system releases signaling molecules, aka hormones, into the bloodstream, and these cause gradual changes. For the most part, these changes are going to take a while to settle in. And then the nervous system utilizes neurons to transmit signals throughout the body. This causes more immediate and rapid changes. Like, for example, if you want to move your arm, you can do that pretty much immediately. All right, so now let's talk about maintaining the body. So we have to maintain a good internal environment for things to work well. So there's kind of two different types of animals here. A regulator has internal mechanisms that control internal change, while a conformer has internal conditions that change with variable conditions. And just a piece of vocab, homeostasis is maintaining internal balance. You're going to hear this word a lot. So, basically, mechanism, you have a set point where everything is happy, and you have a stimulus, which is a fluctuation from that set point, and it's detected by some kind of sensor. And that sensor is going to signal the control center to trigger a response. That's basically how maintaining homeostasis is going to work on the most basic level. And then we utilize something called feedback control. You might have heard this in different contexts, but negative feedback essentially dampens the stimulus. So for example, it's I touch something, it's really, really hot, so my negative feedback would be, pulling my finger away, so it's not so hot, right? And then positive feedback, it amplifies the stimulus. So, having something, it stimulates more of that something. And you're going to find this less often than you would with negative feedback. All right, so now let's talk about thermoregulation, which is basically regulating body temperature. And so why is thermoregulation so important? Well, it helps with enzyme efficiency, right? Some enzymes are only going to function within a certain temperature range. Membrane fluidity, that's really crucial because your membrane's going to get kind of stiff at lower temperatures, but really fluid at higher temperatures. And there's also lots of temperature-sensitive biochemical processes that happen in animals. So there's two types of regulation, endothermy and ectothermy. And you might have heard this as like warm-blooded and cold-blooded before. But basically endotherms are your quote-unquote warm-blooded animals. They use heat generated by metabolism. This is mammals, birds, some fishes and insects, and a few reptiles. And ectothermy, which is like cold-bloodedness, they use heat from external sources, so like many reptiles and fishes. And in general, ectotherms are going to eat less because they spend less of their energy trying to maintain that internal temperature, and they tend to tolerate larger fluctuations in internal temperature since, their temperature is largely controlled by their variable environment, right? So, there are also terms for variation in body temperature. So a poikilotherm is one where the body temperature varies with the environment. And a homeotherm is where the body temperature stays constant. It's important to note that poikilotherm and homeotherm, do not like correspond to endothermy or ectothermy automatically. So there's a lot of endotherms that are actually poikilotherms. For example, bats, they hibernate in the winter, and although they are endotherms, that means that their body temperature is going to vary with the environment. And a lot of fish are both ectotherms and homeotherms because, if they are in the ocean's temperature stays pretty constant, and thus their body temperature will stay constant if they are ectotherms, right? Because they're using heat from the ocean. All right, so now let's talk balancing heat loss and gain. So, there are ways of exchanging heat, and it's always from high heat to low heat sources. So there's radiation, evaporation, convection, and conduction. You've probably heard these words before. But they're just, various ways. So radiation would be like, the way you feel the sun. Evaporation, right, so evaporation actually causes some degree of cooling. And then convection, that has to do with fluids, motion, and then conduction is just straight up touching something. So there are adaptations that are meant to help balance heat loss and gain. So insulation helps, against heat loss. So it reduces heat flow between the animal and the environment. So on the surface of animal bodies, you're going to find hair and feathers. So goosebumps are because mammals and birds raise hair or feathers in response to cold, and that traps a thicker layer of air right above their skin, and that helps maintain some of that heat. And then beneath the body surface, you may find adipose tissue. For example, marine animals use blubber as a layer of insulation. So there's also circulatory adaptations, vasodilation, vasoconstriction. So if you find that in the heat you turn red, that's because of vasodilation, which is basically when your blood vessels dilate and come to the surface. And that's because that way they can exchange some of their heat with the environment. And it's the opposite for vasoconstriction. Then there's also countercurrent exchange, which is basically a system where you're maximizing or minimizing heat loss, and you're going to find that done in a lot of like extremities, like your fingers or like the the feet of a goose. So there's also evaporative cooling, right? So that is basically using evaporation to help cool an animal. So that's why you sweat, because when you sweat and that sweat evaporates, that actually leaves a cooling effect on your skin. And then that's why dogs pant. That's kind of like their version of sweating, right? So, yeah. And then there's also behavioral responses, and you're going to find this mostly in ectotherms. So if they're cold, they're going to seek warmth, they're going to orient their body towards heat, expand their surface area exposed to the heat. If they're hot, they're going to bathe, they're going to seek coolness, like shade, and they're going to reduce the surface area they have exposed to heat. And a really cool example of this is in dragonflies. So they have this posture called like the obelisk posture. Essentially, when you see a dragonfly, they're kind of like flat. Their wings and everything are just facing you. But in the obelisk posture, essentially they kind of stand with their body vertical, and that way they have less surface area facing the sun. And then this is also seen in social behavior. So for endotherms, penguins can huddle together, and that helps conserve a lot of heat. In ectotherms, honeybees also huddle if they're cold, and they transport water to their hive and fan their wings if it's hot. And then just some more. You can balance heat loss and gain by adjusting metabolic heat production. And you're going to find this in endotherms. So thermogenesis, basically you have muscle activity like moving and shivering, and that's going to generate heat. So shivering, essentially that's just your body telling your muscles to kind of move, not for the sake of like getting you anywhere, but that just helps generate some heat. There's also non-shivering thermogenesis, and this is where mitochondria are signaled to increase energy production to make heat and not ATP. And you have brown fat, so and that's specialized for rapid heat production. So brown fat is very high in mitochondria. That's why it's called brown. It's the mitochondria that give it that color. So in adults, you're not going to find a lot of brown fat. Mainly find it around your collarbone. But in babies, babies have a lot of brown fat. So yeah. And what's interesting is that you can find metabolic heat production in some reptiles, like female Burmese pythons incubate their eggs through shivering. And then there's also acclimatization. So birds and mammals have thicker feathers and fur in the winter, and they shed during the summer. So that's going to help them with the change in seasons. All right, so now let's talk physiological thermostats and fever. So our big physiological thermostat is the hypothalamus in your brain. Controls all the homeostasis things. If you ever hear a question about homeostasis, hypothalamus is kind of like a little buzzword right there. Those are two things that you should associate together, hypothalamus and homeostasis. So it controls, body temperature, hunger, all sorts of things. So fever is something you find in mammals and birds. You've probably had a fever before. The whole point of a fever is basically to ward off against pathogens that have entered your body. And what's interesting is that ectotherms, although they can't have a traditional fever, they have what we call a behavioral fever sometimes. So a behavioral fever entails basically the ectotherm actually going out and seeking more warmth. So say, an ectotherm that uses behavioral fever gets sick with some pathogen, they're going to try and get into the sun and stuff to kind of induce a fever that's going to help kill the pathogen. All right, so now let's talk energy use. So quantifying energy use is pretty important if you're going to evaluate it. So the metabolic rate is the amount of energy an animal uses in a given time interval. And the way you determine metabolic rate is by monitoring the rate of heat loss with a calorimeter, measuring the amount of oxygen consumed and the amount of carbon dioxide produced, or measuring the rate of food consumption, the amount of energy in food, and chemical energy lost in waste products. And this in particular is a good long-term method. So here are two big vocab words you should know. They're basal metabolic rate and standard metabolic rate. So basal metabolic rate, you may have heard this in kind of like a dieting context. So this is the resting metabolic rate for endotherms. So if you just put an endotherm in a room and literally just told it to breathe and do nothing, this would be the metabolism going on. So the standard metabolic rate is the same thing, but just for ectotherms. There's just two separate terms for the two types of animals. So metabolic rate is going to be directly proportional to mass to the 3/4 power, and the amount of energy needed per gram of body weight is inversely proportional to body size. All right, and just real quick, hibernation and estivation, which are just both methods of kind of resting during different seasons. Hibernation is when you lower energy use in the winter. Estivation is doing that during the summer, and they reduce energy use. And yeah, that's it for the lesson. I hope that was informative. If that helped you, please leave a like or a comment, and please subscribe for more content. Thank you.